Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Lucy Tassel.
I'm Zara Seidler.
This week, the UK Supreme Court handed down a landmark decision finding that a woman is defined by biological sex under the law. It means transgender women with legal documentation reflecting their transition are not entitled to the same sex discrimination protections as biological women. Today, we'll be breaking down the decision, how it came to be, and what the response has been.
Lucy, the legal definition of a woman is a fairly large concept for the courts to tackle. How does this sort of question even come before the UK Supreme Court? Can you take us back to the beginning of this story?
Yeah, this has been going on for quite a few years now. It started in Scotland in 2018, and the fact that that's where it began is important.
Yeah.
Get back to that later. But basically, in 2018, the Scottish Parliament passed a law mandating that boards of public organisations be 50% women, 50% men. And the law defined trans women who had or were planning to have gender-affirming surgeries as women under this law, meaning they could contribute to the 50%. Now, in the UK, since 2004, there's a legal process that trans people can follow to be recognised as their, this is UK government language, affirmed gender. It's called a gender recognition certificate. According to the UK government, a person must meet several requirements. This includes being over 18, having lived as their affirmed gender for a certain period of time, and you have to have approval from 2 doctors, and then an expert panel reviews any applications that come through. Scotland's Parliament said trans women who have this certificate should count towards the public quota that they were instituting.
Okay, so it's 2018. The Scottish Parliament has passed this law trying to entrench gender quotas for public boards.
Yeah.
That includes trans women who can form part of that 50%. Obviously, though, that's not where this story ends.
No.
What happened in response to that law being legislated?
In response, a group formed called For Women Scotland, hereafter FWS.
Yeah.
They believe, and I'm just quoting from their website here, that there are only 2 sexes, that a person's sex is not a choice, nor can it be changed. FWS, on these grounds, brought a case against the Scottish Government. They argued that defining a woman was actually beyond the powers of the Scottish Government because it's devolved from the UK. That's the official word.
Okay, what does that official word actually mean, devolved?
So basically, Scotland is a country, but it's also part of the UK.
Yeah.
So England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. As a result, Scotland has 2 governments. It has the Scottish government. It has responsibilities like law and order, education, healthcare and social services. The leader of the Scottish government is called the First Minister. Then the UK government, which is over the top, its responsibilities include immigration, energy, employment, and human rights, which is important to this. The Scottish government is below the UK government, so its decisions can be superseded, which has happened actually. TDA has covered this a couple of times in the last couple of years. So the UK overruled a previous attempt by Scotland to make it easier for people to apply for that gender recognition certificate that I mentioned earlier. That's actually, it's related, but it is entirely separate. So the UK overruled that decision. Another important decision was in 2014, Scotland held a referendum on becoming independent from the UK. It failed. And then in 2022, a UK court found Scotland's government needs to ask for UK Parliament permission if it ever wants to hold another referendum.
So there are some examples there of that relationship between Scotland and the UK and the separate governance there. And so going back to the case about the public boards, you're saying that this group sues on the grounds that Scotland isn't allowed to do what it's done there in legislating those quotas and including trans women in them?
Yes, they basically were arguing you can't take steps to define a woman in this way. You don't have the power to do that.
That's with the UK.
Yeah, that's with the UK. So in 2020, FWS actually won a court challenge on those grounds. In response, the Scottish Government issued a new set of rules. It said basically, our law is aligned with the UK-wide Equality Act, which came into effect in 2010. They basically said, no, we do have the power to do this, and here's the overall law that applies to the whole United Kingdom that proves that we were correct in doing so.
Yeah.
It said the Equality Act defined a woman as, quote, a female of any age, and that a person with a GRC saying that they are female is counted under this definition. That was their rationale. Then, in response to that guidance, FWS launched another legal challenge, which is the one we're talking about today. It argued the Act actually defines women by, quote, biological sex. That's their rationale. And that's the case we're talking about today.
Okay, so the case escalates to the UK's highest court, the Supreme Court. What do we know about the trial?
What's interesting to me about the trial is that this is being argued between FWS and the Scottish Government about the place of trans women under the law. So trans women, despite being the subject of this case, are not like a represented party, if that makes sense. So a UK legal NGO called the Good Law Project analysed the trial. They said no trans people gave evidence. Victoria McLeod is the UK's first trans female judge. She often comments on legal matters. She told The Guardian she tried to intervene in the case but was denied. And she actually says she's left the UK because she doesn't believe it's safe for her to live there anymore. Ultimately, the case was decided by a panel of 5 Supreme Court justices, and they unanimously agreed in FWS's case earlier this week.
Okay, so ultimately they found that a woman is defined by biological sex under the law, under the Equalities Act. Can you talk to me about the reasoning that these judges put behind their judgment?
A core part of their judgment was that they said the 2010 Act, that this was centering on, the interpretation of this Act, they said this Act is actually based on a previous Act, the 1975 Sex Discrimination Act. And they said, quote, there is no doubt that Parliament intended the words man and woman to refer to biological sex at that time when that original act was written in 1975. And they said, this new act is based on the old act. It's all of a piece. They also found that extending these sex discrimination protections to people with GRCs would lead to confusion.
GRCs, there is that certificate
the
you were
certificate,
talking about.
Yeah. And they raised concerns around single-sex spaces, which, quote, require a biological interpretation of sex in order to function coherently. So that's things like single-sex bathrooms, changing rooms, sport, the armed forces. The judges did note that trans people are still protected from discrimination under the Equality Act on the ground of gender reassignment and indirect discrimination on the basis of sex. They said, quote, a trans woman can claim sex discrimination because she is perceived to be a woman, talking there about indirect discrimination. I will be very interested to see any future tests of that precedent.
Okay, so this is a fairly landmark decision. You know, this sort of definition, it's so fraught. It's been spoken about in the media, in political circles for so long, and here we have this judgment. What has the response to the verdict actually been?
So FWS was obviously very excited. There's a number of other groups like them in the UK. FWS said that they were, quote, absolutely jubilant, and certainly the response from those other groups has also been very positive. There's a major supporter of FWS, both publicly and literally financially, in Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling, who made a series of posts on X celebrating the outcome.
So she was financially backing the group?
Yes, she contributed money towards their legal fees a couple of years ago, and she has been very openly in favour of this stance and in favour of this group. She said, quote, the fact that so many UK trans activists are shrieking about injustice says it all. You never had the rights you claim you've lost. You had demands. So some fairly strong words from her there. The Scottish Government said they accepted the ruling and would engage on its implications, basically figuring out what that means for them.
Implementation,
Yeah. Trans advocacy groups have spoken out against the ruling, as you would expect. One group, Trans Actual, said, quote, the intent seems clear to exclude trans people wholesale from participating in UK society. Today, we are feeling very excluded. And a local organisation, Scottish Trans, told people not to panic and that it would carefully read the judgment to understand what its impact will be day to day.
Lucy, just to end with, I do want to understand whether a judgment like this could have any implications domestically here in Australia. Obviously, very separate jurisdictions, but Australia is often both culturally and legally influenced by decisions in the UK. Do you think we could see a similar move here?
It's entirely possible. I won't say it's not possible. However, I will say, certainly at the risk of seeming short-sighted, I think it is currently unlikely. There's a few reasons why. According to a global survey by Ipsos in 2023, more than half of Australians believe trans people should use single-sex facilities that correspond to their lived gender, and 4 in 5 believe trans people should be protected from discrimination, which is actually above the global average. So Australia is perhaps more accepting on this one framework, according to this survey. There have been demonstrations from groups like FWS in Australia. There is a presence. There was one in Melbourne a couple of years ago. In terms of the literal legal precedent around trans women and sex discrimination, there is a past case that can illustrate this. Last year, the federal court found in favour of a trans woman. Her name is Roxanne Tickle. She argued she had been discriminated against when she was kicked off a women-only app by the app's founder, who has repeatedly and publicly denied Tickle is a woman. Ultimately, also, in terms of the actual fundamentals of where this case started from, which in 2018, we're talking about the gender balanced boards issue, Australia has targets already in place for government boards, and overall we're actually beating them. In 2023, women held more than half of total positions on Australian government boards. So even the impetus for this specific case, there's not necessarily a need for that in Australia because we're already achieving those goals. So possible, not probable, is my feeling.
Well, Lucy, thank you for breaking down that story. It's certainly a really big one and so many moving parts there that will affect so many people. So appreciate you explaining all of that. And thank you for joining us for another week of the Daily Aus. We hope you enjoy your long weekend. We will be back on Monday morning to accompany you on that public holiday with a bit of news. But until then, have a great weekend with your families.